before the Viking longships ever touched the shores of England, before the raids and invasions that would change the course of British history, the island was ruled by the Anglo-Saxons, a people with their own unique kingdoms, culture, politics, and vulnerabilities. In the 8th century, England was not a unified country. Instead, it was a patchwork of smaller kingdoms, often referred to as the Heptarchy, 7 main realms that dominated the political landscape: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. These kingdoms frequently shifted in power and influence, engaging in alliances, wars, and political maneuvering in their struggle for dominance. Among these, 3 kingdoms stood out during this period: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, and Wessex in the south. Each had its moment of supremacy, but in the 8th century it was Mercia that rose to preeminence under powerful kings like Ethelbald and later Offa, who ruled from 757 to 796. Offa, one of the most notable Anglo-Saxon rulers before Alfred the Great, was instrumental in shaping early English identity. His reign marked the peak of Mercian power. He extended Mercian control over much of southern England and engaged diplomatically with Charlemagne, the Frankish emperor on the continent. This suggests that by the late 8th century, at least some Anglo-Saxon rulers were beginning to view themselves as part of a broader European political world. But despite growing political organization, Anglo-Saxon England remained a deeply fragmented land. Local lords held significant power, and loyalty was often tied to kinship and land rather than to a central authority. The social order was hierarchical, dominated by kings, nobles, and the church, with common people known as ceorls forming the backbone of agricultural and military life. The church played a central role in Anglo-Saxon society. By the 8th century, Christianity had taken root across most of England, replacing earlier pagan beliefs. Monasteries such as those at Lindisfarne, Jarrow, and Canterbury became centers of learning, spiritual life, and political influence. These institutions were not only religious centers, but also repositories of wealth, with land, treasures, and libraries of rare manuscripts. Their relative isolation and riches would soon make them attractive targets to those who sought easy plunder. Economically, Anglo-Saxon England was largely agrarian. Villages clustered around farms, and most people lived off the land. Trade was local, though coastal towns began to see some international commerce, especially with Francia and the Low Countries. Coins bearing the names of kings and mints indicate a growing economy and increased political control over money supply, especially under rulers like Offa, who even issued a gold coin modeled on the Islamic dinar, a testament to early global connections. But beneath this growing prosperity and regional stability, there were cracks. Constant internal rivalries between kingdoms, disputes over succession, and local rebellions kept the land in a state of near-constant flux. There was no standing army, no strong navy, and no central defense system against outside threats. In the next few years, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, once focused on rivalries and faith, would be plunged into chaos. Across the sea, in the cold northern lands of Scandinavia, a different world was taking shape, a world of fierce warriors, master shipbuilders, and fearless raiders. The Vikings were coming, and nothing in England would ever be the same again. In the late 8th century, as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms carried on their rivalries and the monasteries of England thrived in quiet devotion, a new force began to stir across the North Sea. They were not yet feared, not yet fully known, but soon their name would echo through every corner of Europe: the Norsemen, the Vikings. But who were they really? To understand the Viking invasions of England, we must first understand the people behind them, their origins, their way of life, and what drove them from their northern homelands toward foreign shores. The term Viking doesn't refer to a single tribe or nation. It describes a lifestyle, that of seafaring raiders and explorers practiced by people from what is now Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. These Norse societies were not unified kingdoms in the early days. Instead, they were collections of small chieftaincies and clans, governed by local leaders known as jarls, and shaped by harsh climates, limited farmland, and deeply rooted traditions. Their society was structured, but it was also flexible. At the top were kings and jarls, followed by freemen, farmers, craftsmen, and traders, and below them thralls or slaves. Unlike many European societies of the time, Norse women had comparatively more rights. They could own property, initiate divorce, and even rule in their husband's absence. The Norse people lived off both land and sea. Their diets included barley, fish, meat, and dairy, and their homes were longhouses made of wood and turf, built to endure the cold. Their craftsmanship was advanced. They made tools, jewelry, and weapons with remarkable skill. But their greatest innovation, and the one that would carry their name far beyond their homelands, was the longship. Sleek, fast, and shallow-drafted, Viking longships could cross open seas or navigate narrow rivers. They were light enough to be carried across land and strong enough to survive the Atlantic. With these ships, Norsemen could appear suddenly, strike quickly, and vanish before local forces could respond. This ability gave rise to one of the most feared military strategies of the early medieval period, the lightning raid. Religion in Norse society was pagan. They believed in a pantheon of gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, and Loki among them, and lived by a worldview that valued courage, honor, and the glory earned through battle. The concept of Valhalla, a warrior's afterlife, was central to Viking culture. Dying in combat was not a failure, it was a passage to something greater. But the question remains, why did they begin raiding? The answer lies not in a single cause, but in a complex web of factors, political, economic, social, and even environmental, all pushing the Norse people toward the sea. First, there was limited land and overpopulation. Much of Scandinavia is mountainous, forested, or unsuitable for large-scale agriculture. With inheritance systems favoring firstborn sons, many younger siblings were left without land or prospects, forcing them to look outward for opportunity. Raiding, trading, and settling overseas became an attractive solution for restless, landless men. One cannot ignore the cultural mindset of the Norse. Their society celebrated bravery, adventure, and warrior values. A good death in battle meant an honored afterlife in Valhalla. To fight and win was glorious. To raid and return with riches was a triumph. This was not viewed as savagery. It was the way of their world. Technological innovation also played a part. The development of the Viking longship was revolutionary. These vessels were swift, agile, and capable of navigating both open seas and shallow rivers. In the year 793, the world changed forever when a Viking raiding party descended upon the peaceful monastery at Lindisfarne in Northumbria. The attack was brutal and unexpected. Monks were killed, treasure was taken, and the sacred site was left in ruins. This was no longer trade, it was war. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the beginning of Viking exploration, but it marked the beginning of a new phase, the Viking Age. Over the next decades, waves of Norse raiders, warriors, and settlers would strike England's coasts, rivers, and towns, pushing deeper into the heart of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. By the close of the 8th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm of life, ruled by kings, guided by bishops, and rooted in the church. Though rivalries flared among kingdoms like Mercia and Northumbria, there was a sense of divine order. But in the year 793, this sense of stability was shattered. The winds changed direction, and with them came the first storm of a new era. That summer, a fleet of unfamiliar ships appeared on the northeastern horizon. Their long, narrow hulls cut through the waters off the Northumbrian coast. At their oars sat men with no crosses, no Christian kings, only shields, axes, and a hunger for what lay inland. These were Norsemen, and they had come not to trade, but to strike. Their target, the monastery of Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island, had been founded over a century earlier by Saint Aidan under the patronage of King Oswald of Northumbria. It had grown into a respected religious center, a place of quiet devotion, scholarly learning, and monastic discipline. Monks here copied manuscripts, kept relics, and prayed in isolation from the world. On a fateful day in June 793, that peace was violently broken. The Viking raiders descended on Lindisfarne with speed and ferocity. They stormed the monastery, tearing through its stone halls, cutting down the monks who stood in their path. Sacred relics were smashed, manuscripts were trampled or burned. Gold and silver were looted from altars. Those who survived were taken as slaves. Others were left dead beside the sacred shrines they had tended. The attack shocked the Christian world. It wasn't just an assault on a remote island. It was an assault on Christendom itself. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was more than a massacre, it was a warning. In this early Christian mindset, such an event could not simply be political or military. It was interpreted as divine punishment. Many believed that their sins had invited the wrath of God, carried out by pagan hands. But the Vikings weren't motivated by religion. They were motivated by opportunity. Lindisfarne was rich, exposed, and undefended. It had everything a raiding party could hope for. It was the perfect target. This raid marked a turning point. Until now, Norse contact with England had been limited to trade or exploration. The attack on Lindisfarne transformed that relationship. No longer distant merchants or curious outsiders, the Norsemen had become a threat, feared and unpredictable. In the years that followed Lindisfarne, Viking raids would become more frequent, more brutal, and more organized. Monasteries, towns, and ports across England would be targeted in rapid succession. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 was more than an attack. It was the spark that ignited the Viking Age, a turbulent era that would tear through England's kingdoms and reshape its destiny for nearly 3 centuries. After the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, many in Anglo-Saxon England hoped it was an isolated event. But it wasn't. The attack marked the beginning of a pattern that would continue for decades. That single raid sent ripples of fear across the Christian world. In the years that followed, Viking raids became more frequent, more organized, and more widespread. These early Norse raids were not part of a formal invasion. Instead, they were carried out by small bands of warriors who used fast ships to strike quickly and escape before any resistance could form. In 794, just 1 year after Lindisfarne, another monastery in the north at Jarrow was attacked. Jarrow had also been a center of learning and religious activity. Its destruction showed that the Vikings had no intention of stopping. They were targeting not just random settlements, but important religious sites that were known for their wealth and lack of defenses. In the following decades, raids increased in both frequency and reach. The Norsemen began expanding southward, testing new territories and learning more about the landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. By the early 9th century, they were raiding along the coasts of Wessex, Kent, and East Anglia. In 835, they attacked the Isle of Sheppey off the coast of Kent, marking one of the first recorded Viking raids in the south of England. 2 years later, in 837, the Vikings returned to the southern coast. This time they encountered resistance. King Egbert of Wessex led his forces against them at Carhampton in Somerset. Though details are limited, the chronicle records the encounter, showing that some Anglo-Saxon rulers were now trying to mount defenses. But the Vikings were not easy opponents. Their hit-and-run tactics, mobility at sea, and lack of a permanent base in England made them hard to track and harder to fight. Even when kings like Egbert engaged them directly, it was difficult to prevent future raids. As these attacks continued, they began to affect not only the religious communities, but also the population at large. Coastal settlements, often small and poorly defended, were frequent targets. People began to abandon these areas. Trade routes were disrupted. Fishing villages were no longer safe. The psychological effect of these raids was just as damaging as the physical destruction. For many Anglo-Saxons, the sea, once a source of trade and travel, now represented danger and death. Over time, the Vikings refined their strategies. They began to raid during the summer and return to Scandinavia in the winter, a cycle that allowed them to strike repeatedly while avoiding long-term occupation or battle with large forces. They learned where the richest targets were, how to navigate England's rivers, and which kingdoms were weaker than others. As their knowledge of the land improved, they began sailing deeper inland, no longer limiting themselves to coastal raids. In 841, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes another wave of attacks along the south coast. In 842, a particularly violent raid took place in London and Rochester, where the Chronicle speaks of a great slaughter. Despite the growing number of raids, England remained divided. The major kingdoms, Wessex in the south, Mercia in the Midlands, Northumbria in the north, and East Anglia in the east, were not united in their defence. Each king dealt with the Viking threat in his own way, and there was little cooperation between them. Some kingdoms tried to negotiate or pay tribute. Others focused on defending key areas, but with limited resources and no central authority, their responses were mostly reactive, not strategic. Religious life also changed during this time. The church had once been a central part of everyday life in Anglo-Saxon England. Now, many monks and priests abandoned their monasteries or moved inland in search of safety. Monastic libraries were looted or destroyed. Valuable manuscripts were lost. By the mid-9th century, it was clear that the Viking threat was not just a passing problem. The attacks had become a normal part of life for many living near the coasts and rivers. Anglo-Saxon England had entered a new phase. The Norsemen had moved from raiding occasionally to raiding regularly, and the kingdoms of England were still struggling to mount a coordinated or effective defense. But even then, these were still raids, fast, destructive, and temporary. What came next would be something much more serious. A new kind of force was forming across the sea, larger, more organized, and with different goals. By the middle of the 9th century, Viking raids had become a regular threat along the English coasts and riverways. Monasteries, towns, and trading settlements had learned to expect them during the warmer months, and many Anglo-Saxon rulers were adjusting to this new reality. But in 865, the nature of the Viking presence in England changed dramatically. What had previously been seasonal raids evolved into full-scale invasion. This was no longer just about plunder. The Vikings had come to conquer. The force that arrived in 865 was known in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as the Great Heathen Army. Unlike previous groups of raiders, this army was large, organized, and well-equipped for a prolonged campaign. Its size is still debated, but it likely numbered several thousand men, far more than any previous Viking force. It was composed of warriors from Denmark, Norway, and possibly even Sweden. This coalition of Norse fighters was led by several prominent commanders, among them Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ivar, names that would soon become infamous across the English kingdoms. The Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia in 865. The kingdom, led at the time by King Edmund, offered little resistance. Instead of fighting, the East Anglians provided horses to the invaders, likely in an effort to avoid destruction and buy time. With supplies and transportation secured, the Viking force turned its attention northward toward Northumbria, a kingdom already weakened by internal divisions. Northumbria, once a dominant power in the early Anglo-Saxon period, was in decline by the mid-9th century. In 866, the kingdom was ruled by two rival claimants, King Osbert and King Ella. This internal conflict had destabilized the region and left it vulnerable to outside threats. The Great Heathen Army seized the opportunity. In the autumn of 866, they marched on York, the heart of Northumbrian power. At the time, York was one of the largest and most important cities in England. But in November 866, York fell to the Vikings with little resistance. The Norsemen fortified the city, establishing it as a base for further operations. Realizing the severity of the threat, the rival Northumbrian kings, Osbert and Ella, set aside their differences and joined forces to retake the city. In early 867, they led a combined army against the Viking-held York. But the attack ended in disaster. The Northumbrian forces were lured into the city, where the Vikings used the narrow streets and fortified walls to their advantage. In the ensuing battle, both Osbert and Ella were killed. According to some later Norse sagas, Ella met a particularly gruesome end, supposedly executed by the Vikings using the blood eagle ritual. The Viking army installed a puppet ruler Ecbert and took firm control of the region. With York as their stronghold, the Norse began integrating themselves into the political landscape of Northumbria. Meanwhile, the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were left reeling. The fall of Northumbria was a shock. No other English kingdom had yet suffered such a complete collapse at the hands of the Norse. For the first time, it was clear that the Viking threat extended far beyond raids. This was organized war, and the Great Heathen Army was just getting started. In the next episode, we will follow the Viking advance into Mercia and East Anglia, and see how King Edmund would become both a martyr and a symbol of resistance against the Norse invaders.